morning, everyone. Hope you're all having a wonderful day today. Today, we're taking a look at a complete KAK build. This specifically is their 13.9 barrel, and this is probably going to be a long one. We have a lot of stuff to get into, but before we get into that, if you want to help me out personally, you can, of course, like, share, and subscribe. That's all free. It does help me out quite a bit. Go ahead and comment your favorite budget barrel in the comments down below. It won't be this one by the end of the video, though there are some good components in here as well. And there's also my website, which in theory has some things in stock. There's also Subscribestar, which is basically just a pro to a Patreon. With all of that out of the way, full disclosure, on this build, a couple months ago, maybe a little bit longer than that, KAK reached out to me, a couple of the guys from them, basically just asking if I wanted to test out and review any of their products, which is pretty standard. Now, in response to that, I sent them an entire list for a build of specific components that I want from everything on the upper receiver is from KAK, including their own dimpling jig. I wanted to try out just everything. Assembly, it was all from KAK. So this is a 100% KAK upper receiver. Initially, the entire build was from KAK. I did not pay for anything on the build whatsoever. They sent it out to me free of charge for testing. Now, that being said, though, this is one of the few upper receivers that we've had legitimately fail testing, and where I was basically just done with it. There was nothing more that I was interested in testing on it. And the failure point on this was the barrel. Now, specifically two barrels, because the first barrel that they sent out had a issue which we'll get into. And I wanted to give them a little bit of the benefit of the doubt. So I bought a second barrel with my own money, as well as a second 4-prong flash hider, which we'll get into later on. They did not know that I did not. They did not know that I had an issue with the first or second barrel until I sent them an email, I believe, yesterday at this point, that notifying them of the issues, and I believe they will get this barrel back just so that they can kind of figure out what the issue is, because, again, this is the second barrel. The first barrel they sent out. The second barrel I paid for with my own money. They had no idea that I bought that second barrel or flash hider in this case. They also probably don't know that I've also been a dealer for KAK, so I buy or have bought in the past several $1,000s worth of components from them. No major components, mostly just gas blocks, tubes, and I believe finishing kits as well, maybe some A2 flash hiders, because they generally have pretty good pricing on just kind of like those little accessory pieces. Now, when it comes to their barrels, the only other experience that I've had with their barrels is on Hop's old 12.5 upper receiver, which I think I titled that video like the worst upper receiver ever and how I fixed it, because that 12.5 KAK was violently overgassed with a .093 gas port size, which is way too big for a 12.5 mid. Should have been like a .086 or something a little smaller. And that barrel was also not particularly accurate, though it did have a very high round count. Now, getting into this barrel and the specific failure that we were having, both with the first barrel and with the second barrel, and then we'll go through kind of the process of elimination for removing other factors. Now, we are actually going to talk about every component on this build, but just the short of it is the barrel is bad, don't buy, and every other component is just fine. But because we want to go a little bit more detail about why the barrel is bad, how it failed multiple times at this point, is going to be with accuracy degradation as it relates to heat. So on the first KAK barrel, I probably put anywhere between 500 and 700 rounds on it throughout testing. I used it with the Athlon 1-10, with the Vector 1-8, and with the Sig Romeo 7S. Now, when I initially noticed the issue was not during initial zero. It was after about 150 to 200 rounds filming the intro for the Vector 1-8. Now, when I film an intro, it is usually between 150 and 200 rounds, somewhere between 5 and 8 magazines, depending on what it is, where I am, and so on and so forth. Then, when I go at the end of the day to do the drop test on the optic to see if it pass, fails, shifts zero, so on and so forth, the group that I got at the end of the day with Norma M193, which we will talk about the ammunition, different uppers, so on and so forth a little bit later on, the group was so bad at 50 yards that it was laughable, it was unusable, and so I actually had to put that optic onto a different gun and retest it because that group was just so bad that the shift in zero, if it was a small shift in zero, would not even be noticeable, because I believe the group was around 20 MOA at 50 yards. It was about a 10-inch group at 50 yards with a high-quality ammo, which, again, we'll get into a little bit later on. So that was the first time I noticed it. Now, at that time, I thought it could have been my assembly issues because, again, they sent out the parts. I put it all together myself Again, we'll get into all of that a little bit later on. The next time that I noticed the issue was with the SIG Romeo 7S. Basically the same story, put about 150, 200 rounds through the upper, filming for an intro. So then after the filming is done for the intro and before we do our drops, we of course do a 5-round control group. Now, just using a red dot, it was 36 yards, and the group that I got was again between 10 and 15 MOA. Just a horrible, horrible group. And again, so bad that I had to switch the optic to a different gun, re-zero, do a control group, drops, so on and so forth, so that I could actually determine if there was a shift in zero. Now, it should be noted that the first barrel that they sent out for me, while it was warm during those groups, it was usually about a 30-minute gap in between when I'm done filming and when I'm set up for the drops. And sometimes I'd even shoot another gun in between there, so it would be like an hour, hour and a half in between the last round fired and when the drops occurred. So while the barrels were definitely somewhere between warm and very warm, they were certainly not shoot 200 rounds and then immediately lay down a group. Now, with the first barrel, I didn't really know exactly what was going on. Again, it could have been an assembly issue, just minor machining defect, something going wrong with it. So I did want to give it at least another chance. So again, I went out with my own money and bought a barrel from their website, the exact same 139556 barrel. We'll get into specifics later on, though they don't really matter all that much. Then I went ahead and started to retest it. So I was out filming a video for gun deals on the Geisley G2S trigger, which is currently in this gun. And after about 150 rounds, noticed that the zero was, or not the zero itself, but the group size had again opened up to about 10 MOA. So at that point, I was fairly certain that it was not a one-off defect. It was not a assembly error, as I assemble all of my guns the exact same way. Again, we'll get into process of elimination a little bit later on. So at that point, I wanted to test my theory about the heat being the primary culprit. So what I did was on a cold bore with, again, Norma M193, which I bought about 2,000 rounds of this ammo, and I'm almost out, so I have a lot of experience with this ammo and how it shoots in different guns. Again, we'll get into that a little bit later on. I did a cold bore group at 50 yards with the KAK included bolt. And I got about a 2-inch group at 50 yards, which is about 4 MOA. Now, 4 MOA with ball is bad, but it's not terrible. Sometimes guns just aren't going to like a specific load. That's fine. Now, something that I did initially right after that was I swapped out the bolt. So I swapped it out to a Toolcraft bolt, and I did another 5-round group to see if there was some sort of headspace issue with their bolt. Again, I got about a 2-inch group, so now we're 10 rounds in, perfectly fine, 2 inches, 4 MOA, no change in accuracy with a Toolcraft bolt. Swapped it out to a lightweight BCG that I had laying around, so I tested 3 different BCGs to check for some sort of potential headspace issue, and again, basically got the same result of about 2 inches at 50 yards, or about 4 MOA. Then I wanted to test a bit of a heavier load, so I went with a Nosler 77 grain match, and again at 50 yards, got about an inch group, so about 2 MOA. So on a cold bore, because again, these are not shot back to back to back, there's a few minutes in between each group, so it's basically cold, not necessarily cold bore, but it is going to be a very cool barrel for all of these groups. The cool accuracy of this barrel is about 4 to 2 MOA, not particularly great. It's certainly fine and serviceable, but compared to other barrels when we get into value later on, it's pretty poor overall, but I would give it a solid mediocre in terms of its cool accuracy. So then after those 4 cold groups with 3 different BCGs, 2 different types of ammo to kind of get a good indication of if we're having some sort of bolt headspace issue or if we're having some sort of it just doesn't like a specific load, the cold accuracy was again very mediocre. After that, I went ahead and I fired 80 rounds in about 20 to 30 minutes, just using it as I normally would. And then I went ahead with that exact same Norma M193 KAK bolt, retested the accuracy at 50 yards, and came up with a 5-inch group, which is approximately 10 MOA after 80 rounds in about 20 to 30 minutes. Again, the barrels were not blisteringly hot, but they were certainly on the warmer side, and accuracy degraded to an unacceptable level. After putting up a 5-inch group at 50 yards, I was completely done with testing on the upper receiver and barrel, as I believe they have some sort of manufacturing defect. I'm not an engineer, this is all just speculation, but something to do with the stress relieving of the material. Perhaps it's not properly done, perhaps the machining on the inside is not all that great. Something is happening when these barrels get even just a little bit warm, where accuracy will degrade to a borderline not safe to use territory. For instance, that was only after 80 rounds. Normally, again, I'm shooting 150 to 200 rounds for an intro. If you were to take this to a class, a high round count class or a competition or something like that, where you're shooting 200, 300, 400, 500, 600 rounds in the course of a day, it would become absolutely unusable. At least the 2 examples that I've tested, one that they sent out and one that I purchased with my own money. That is my running theory. Again, I'm not an engineer, so I don't know exactly what's going on with it. If it's a material defect, if it's a machining defect, something to do with the stress relieving process, if it's just a design defect, because I don't particularly like the design of the barrel either. At this point, though, we need to take apart the upper receiver so we can talk about the barrel a little bit more and go through our process of elimination on all of the other variables. So now we have the KAK handguard off, which gives us a much better look at what's going on with the barrel. Now, the gas block might look pinned in place. However, I did pin the initial barrel. However, again, on the second barrel, I wanted to make sure that I wasn't doing anything wrong, messing with the harmonics, so on and so forth. So this one here looks like it's pinned. However, the barrel has not been touched. It's just that there is a hole in the gas block, again, from that initial barrel. Now, what I have done to it is there is a very tiny dimple, which I did personally do with their .750 dimpling jig. The depth is very, very shallow, and it's just enough to get the rear set screw just a little bit to bite into. And of course, I did pin and weld as well on the 4-prong flash hider, which is included. So those are added processes that I have done to the barrel that could influence a little bit, to be fair. However, certainly not to the extent that we're seeing with it. Now, to get into some of the other variables, we'll probably start with the ammunition. Now, this is, again, Norma M193. This is what I use for basically all of the testing. Actually, this is what I use for all of the testing when it comes to accuracy degradation on the 13.9. So to remove this as a variable, we have tested this in a lot of different setups. One of my personal favorites is on the exact same day that this gun was shooting 4 MOA with that Norma. My Mark IV upper receiver, which is absolutely not a fair comparison. This one here was shooting that Norma at 100 yards at 1 MOA for a 55 grain ball. Again, that Norma has performed very well in a lot of different upper receivers. Yes, this is a heavy barrel, so is the KAK. We'll get into that a little bit later on, but that ammunition is absolutely capable of very good accuracy, not only out of course, the Mark IV, which is a heavy barrel, supposed to be very accurate, but also it shot 2 MOA out of 2 11.5 free floated. This is a Delton 11.5 that, again, that Norma shot about 2 MOA out of. It also shot 2 MOA out of a Colt, which is a little bit more expensive, chrome lined barrel. It also was able to go out to 600 yards in both the Mark III 14.5 and the NSR Pro, which is a pencil barrel 14.7. The accuracy of the ammunition itself in most high quality or decent quality barrels has been around 2 MOA, which is very good for just a basic ball round that I think I paid like 36 cents a round for, which right now is very good. And then again, in something that is more of a precision setup like the Mark IV, it will shoot down around 1 MOA and is certainly capable of 500 and 600 yards given the right shooter and conditions. So the accuracy that we're seeing out of the KAK, the base cold accuracy of about 4 MOA, is already less than what we're seeing in a variety of different guns. Now, that's not necessarily a bad thing. Again, certain barrels aren't going to like certain loads, weights, so on and so forth. This is the second one that I've tested, though, of course. So it's not the worst thing that it doesn't shoot that ammo 2 MOA or better. But again, the ammunition itself is accurate, it is reliable, and it has performed very well in a wide variety of different types of barrels, everything from, weird pencil barrels all the way to very heavy barrels on the Mark IV, non-free floated barrels as well, short barrels, long barrels, everything in between. The Norma M193 has performed very well. Now, to remove another variable, that is going to be the optics in question. Maybe there was a fault with all of those optics that I've tested. Again, unfortunately, this Swamp Fox Saber, I've taken out to 600 yards on a 12.5-inch AR-10. This is a 12.5-inch 308 upper. I think that's the last one that I have in stock. Out to, again, 500 yards, 600 yards on the NSR Pro, which is a 14.7 pencil barrel. On the Vector 1-8, I use that on the Mark III, again, going out to about 600 yards with that Norma ammunition. And the Athlon 1-10, I've also taken out to 700 plus yards on the FN barrel, and I think I've used that on a couple different guns as well. The Sig Romeo 7S is basically a tank, and I've used that on a half dozen different guns as well. So the optics are certainly not the problem. The ammunition is certainly not the problem. And if you didn't notice, about half of those guns were guns that I personally assembled. So I would like to think that I personally did not mess up the assembly. Now, getting into the actual assembly on the gun, I basically followed their recommendations with a few slight tweaks. So my builds always start with the upper receiver. I lap the face of the upper receiver using a Wheeler lapping vice or whatever it's called. I forget the exact name of it. I'll annotate it in here. What I use, 220 grit lapping compound until you get rid of about 3/4 of the anodization on the front of the face. That ensures that you have the flattest, most repeatable mounting surface for your barrel extension. So again, you just get a very good lockup. On top of that, I use a bedding material, which is basically a Loctite. I want to say it's like 69-420. And again, what that's supposed to do is give your upper receiver and your barrel the tightest, most concentric fit and give you the possibility for the best accuracy. Now, when we're assembling the barrels, what I do for the torque down method on the barrel nut, they do include a very nice steel barrel nut. Again, every other component on here other than the barrel that KAK sent out is actually decent. Unfortunately, the barrel is so bad that it doesn't matter how nice everything is else is around it. The barrel makes everything basically worthless. So the torque down method on the barrel nut is they recommend doing 35 pounds braking, 35 pounds braking, and then ending somewhere between 50 and 60. I do a very similar method. I do 25, and then 30, 25 brake, 35 brake, and then finally about 50. At 50, I do it twice at the end, so really it ends up somewhere between 50 and 55 foot-pounds on the barrel nut. Plenty of torque. And again, that is how I assemble all of my upper receivers without fail. There's not a single one that I do anything different on. Now, this one here, again, on the gas block itself, it is dimpled with a very small dimple. I'll probably take this off and show you that in just a minute. But it is not pinned, so the barrel itself, there's no additional harmonics that I'm messing with. And on the end here, it is pin and weld. Again, for the pin and weld, I try and go as shallow as possible without the ATF killing my dog. So I'm not sure how well you guys can see that on there, but you can see the barrel itself is not pinned. I didn't mess with the barrel whatsoever. There is the tiniest little pin. Maybe, I don't know if you guys can actually see that, but that dimple is very small. It is, again, just enough for the rear set screw to find a footing in so it doesn't move. I do red thread locker, a high temperature red thread locker that goes up to 450 degrees. And then I torque down to about 25 inch-pounds, sometimes 30 inch-pounds. Different gas blocks. The set screws are not all the same quality. Some of them will start to strip out around 25, 30, 35. So 25 is usually good for a high quality or at least decent quality set screws on gas blocks. Fortunately, the KAK is just fine. So as we discussed, this barrel has some sort of thermal issue. Anytime it gets even remotely hot, the accuracy just absolutely degrades to a point of unusability. Again, borderline unsafe, depending where and what you're shooting at, and is certainly not something that I would recommend for any application. Unfortunately, it only gets worse from there, though, as even if the barrel performed as it did when it was cold, again, about 4 to 2 MOA, which is very mediocre, Unfortunately, everything else about the barrel is not particularly exciting as well. So this is a 13.9, 5.56, 1 in 7 twist, 4150 chromoly vanadium steel, nitride finish. The one thing that I will say nice about this barrel, the one thing that they did do correct is the gas port size, which, if memory serves, is a .081, which is perfectly appropriate for a 13.9 barrel, 13.9 mid-length barrel, which is what this is. Now, my Recce Pros, my 13.7 Recce Pros, those are also mid-length. Those I also set to a .081 gas port size, so those are just a hair softer than the 13.9s, because the 13.9 is, of course, going to have just a little bit more dwell time. But again, perfectly appropriate, out of the box with carbine buffers, carbine springs. It will absolutely cycle most things that you put through it, but it will also cycle high power, full power ammunition very well. For some absolute recoil snobs, you might want to use an H1, 2, 3, so on and so forth, or if you're shooting dedicated suppressed, maybe throw in a heavier spring. But again, for 99% of people, it is gassed very, very well, and something that I have no problem with whatsoever. Now, getting into profile and design and everything else that I personally think is wrong with the barrel, I know some people online were very excited when they knew I was testing this barrel. They saw some of the Instagram posts and were very excited because, again, to a certain group of people, this feature set with this profile is very exciting. Not to me, but to certain people online, this is somewhat of an exciting barrel profile, so we might as well start there. This is a heavy profile. This, there's no way around it. This is a very, very heavy barrel with none of the benefits. So basically, some people see this barrel with the very thin taper towards the end, and they think, wow, that's going to be very well balanced. No, it's just a heavy barrel with an ounce, maybe 2 ounces removed from the most important part of the barrel. So again, this is a very heavy profile. There is no ifs, ands, or buts about it. This is a very heavy profile. The barrel nut that they include barely fits around it, no pun intended. This is a very, very heavy barrel with about an ounce or two, maybe 2 ounces removed from where it's most important. This barrel would be far better if they had removed an ounce from back here, an ounce or two from back here, which again, you would barely notice because this is a very heavy barrel, and then just did a straight .750 taper here at the end. Some people would complain that it's, again, oh, it's less balanced, but no, this isn't less balanced. This is just a heavy barrel with, again, none of the performance. 95% of the weight, 9.5% of the performance. So if we're going to compare it to something that, again, does beat it out in just about every way, this is from a competitor. This is something that I personally use in a lot of my builds because it's an excellent barrel. This is a Roscoe 13.7 mid-length purebred barrel. And people look at this and they say, oh, it's a government profile. It's so unbalanced. And then they look at something like this and they think, oh, that's such a balanced barrel. No, this is double the weight, half the accuracy. So again, while this might be unbalanced to some people, it is certainly a far step above, basically like a 0.7 and 0.75 here at the end. Yeah, it's a little heavy, maybe like a half ounce, a quarter ounce heavier at the end than it could be if they were using a slightly thinner profile. But again, it's 10 to 12 ounces lighter than this barrel. So while this might look balanced, like people say online. Now, again, I'm not saying that a government profile barrel is the best, most efficient profile out there. No, of course not. What I'm saying is that the KAK 13.9 does the lightweight barrel really bad because it's very heavy. However, it does have a very light section at the end. And it does the heavy barrel section very bad as well because it's very light at the end and reduces their accuracy. So if they had just picked one or the other, personally, if they had just put that material back, that extra, again, only an ounce, maybe 2 ounces towards the end of the barrel, it's not going to kill you. And it would almost certainly have improved the accuracy as well. It's also less machining time, less damage to the harmonics, so on and so forth. So this profile, while again, in photos, it might look balanced or look attractive to a certain group of people, in reality, it's just bad. Alrighty, battery number 2, but let's keep going. So this, if I didn't mention it, is part of their value line barrels. Now, unfortunately, the value really isn't there on these barrels. They're around $140 retail, I want to say, and I actually paid $30 more for this barrel than I did for my Roscoe 13.7s, and considerably more than I do for Ballistic Advantage and other barrels, which of course I'm dealers for all of those companies. So again, the value proposition, even if these performed just as their cold bore accuracy, somewhere between 2 and 4 MOA. For 140 bucks, you could definitely do a lot better. The profile doesn't make any sense. It's not a good heavy barrel. It doesn't have any of the benefits of a heavy barrel. It's certainly not a lightweight profile either. If this was a super light profile, putting up 2 to 4 MOA, I'd be okay with that. It's super light, so at least it's giving me some benefit there. But of course, this is doing none of those things. It's just the worst of both worlds in that regard. I would like to talk about the machining and the finish and the material quality, but again, I can't really diagnose what the issue is with the accuracy, so I don't know if it's a material defect, I don't know if it's a machining defect, and I'm not sure if their finishing work, just something was just off on it. So again, the finish looks nice, that I can say. It does have the feature set, the specs are at least fine. 13.7 mid-length, 0.081 gas port size is the appropriate gas port size. 1 in 7 twist, 4150 chrome moly vanadium steel. Can't speak to the specific quality of this barrel seal, but it is at least the right type. But at this point, I think we probably beat the barrel to death, so let's go ahead and talk about the rest of the build, which, again, the rest of the components are actually just fine. I don't have any complaints about them whatsoever. Let's go ahead and start with the 4-prong flash hider. It does have a little bit of a ringing sound. Now, it is designed to work with this 13.9 barrel to boost it up to the legal 16+ inch range, basically. So in combination with their 13.9 barrel, it does the 16-inch thing while not being too particularly long. Feels good, does a good job of removing flash. I haven't noticed the flash on this gun whatsoever. Does have a little bit of pinging sound, but not too bad. Gas block and gas tube. I believe they're 4140 heat-treated gas blocks. No problems. The dimpling jig worked just fine. I've used it on other barrels since then, and I'll probably continue to use it. Came with everything that you need. Works fairly well. Easy to set up. Fairly robust. No complaints about the dimpling jig whatsoever. Gas tube has worked appropriately. Again, the few components that I have tested from KAK and on other builds and used in other builds as well is going to be the gas blocks. I've used probably 50 of them or so. A lot of gas tubes. Maybe some charging handles, A2 flash hiders, completion kits on the upper receivers. All that's just fine. Moving back to the upper receiver, we have a standard 70-75 mil-spec upper receiver. It is marked M4 on the front, kind of like Colt upper receivers are. Not sure if they're just doing that as a little bonus, or if somebody's trying to, have a clone correct build or something like that, they can buy a KAK instead of a Colt and save a bunch of money in that regard. Upper receiver is perfectly fine. Standard forward assist, standard dust cover. Nothing special, again, but it's a good value if you find a KAK upper receiver on a good deal. The one that I have is perfectly fine. I haven't really tested a lot of their other upper receivers, but again, works just fine. Now, talking about their BCG briefly, this is, of course, a KAK BCG. Overall, it seems to be done to a reasonable level. I want to say they charge about 120 bucks for a bolt, which, again, for a complete BCG, is perfectly reasonable. Not the cheapest on the market, certainly not what I would consider to be an expensive bolt either. But overall, the machining quality on it is good. The nitride looks very good. It is held up very well after about, combined between the two barrels, like 1,000, 1,200 rounds in total. So it's held up very well. The nitriding still looks good. It is wearing in a few spots, as you would expect. Bolt lugs look good. Relief cuts on the back, all perfectly fine. The gas key itself is grade 8 fasteners that are torqued down to mil spec. The edges of the gas key are rounded in the back as they should be, which will reduce some friction between the BCG, or the gas key itself, and the upper receiver. Again, nice little touches. I've had no problems with it whatsoever. No failures to extract, no failures to feed, no light primer strikes. Everything seems to be of at least reasonable quality. Even at this point, it still passes the gas ring test, which is perfectly fine. I wouldn't expect the gas rings to go out until we're at about 3,000 to 5,000 rounds, somewhere in that regard. But moving on to one of the last components, this is their charging handle. It is a 70-75 T6 aluminum charging handle with an extended latch, and it is actually very good. If you are looking for a cheap upgrade to a mil-spec charging handle, I think they charge $15 to $25 for these guys, and that is perfectly appropriate. It is a straight upgrade. Basically doesn't cost much more than a standard mil-spec charging handle, and gives you a much bigger latch, which I prefer, and I would actually buy more of these because it works really well. Now, it's not ambidextrous, so if you're a lefty, or if you just want an ambidextrous one, it doesn't do that. But if you just want a left side charger, for most of us out there, it's going to work just fine. Last component that we need to talk about, and it's actually a really good one. I actually don't have any complaints about this whatsoever. This is their 13-inch M-LOK rail. It has 7 sides of M-LOK. It uses a very robust wedge lock system, which I prefer wedge locks to clamp systems, there are better, stronger, more durable lockups on the market for sure. You're going to pay for them, and on top of that, at that point, it really doesn't matter because the rail itself is going to bend or deform before your lockup will fail in most cases. Now, the lockup itself, they use these very large aluminum wedges with very large steel hardware. So here's the bolts on these guys. So it comes with 2 bolts. Now, they recommend on the website 45 inch-pounds. I got them up to 60 inch-pounds just fine, and I'm sure they could take a lot more than that. Very substantial. They work well. They place a lot of contact directly onto the steel barrel nut that is included. Now, on top of that, the substantial steel bolts that they include, on top of course, pulling those clamps into, or those wedges directly into your barrel nut, they also slide right into these channels so that the handguard, in theory, could not, even if they became loose, come forward or back. And then on top of that, you also have anti-rotation tabs on the back. Overall, aesthetically, it works very well. 7 sides of M-LOK for anything that you need to mount. And again, it's not too heavy, and it does all of the things that you want it to do. And I'm not sure what the retail price on these. If the dealer price was a little bit better, I would probably use them in some of my personal builds as well, just because it's a decent handguard that kind of does all the things that you want it to do. Nothing particularly special, but you're not paying particularly special prices either. Now, it should also be mentioned that this handguard did get dropped a couple times, and while it did experience some scuffing and damage to the finish, it didn't bend, deform, or come loose at any point. Again, I did 60 inch-pounds on the wedges with blue Loctite, and in theory, those should never come loose on you. The lockup seems to be just fine. The only time where I would be slightly hesitant in using a rail like this is if you were mounting like $2,000 PEC at the end or something like that, and you were in a very arduous circumstance and you just absolutely had to make sure that that laser did not lose zero. I would probably spend an extra $100 on the rail, but again, most people looking at a sub $100 rail are probably not worried about that all that much. Putting on a foregrip, pads, lights, maybe a front sight post, something like that, and you're going to call it a day. So that's about it for the upper receiver. Again, all of the components other than the barrel are perfectly acceptable, especially for the price. I would consider them to be just fine. If you own any of them, the handguard's decent, gas blocks and tubes have all worked just fine. Upper receiver's perfectly fine. The BCG is not the cheapest on the market, but it performed fine. I didn't have any issues with it. The charging handle with the extended latch is nice. The 4-prong flash hider works well for a 13.9 barrel. It's a very inexpensive way to get a 13.9 pin and weld it up to 16 inches. Ed did a good job with flash reduction. So again, I don't have an issue with anything else on this build other than the barrel being absolutely atrocious. Now, again, I believe this barrel is going to be going back to KAK. And then at a later point in time, maybe I'll update you with their findings, or maybe we'll never hear about it again. So with all of that out of the way, guys, I hope you enjoyed the video. Let me know what you guys think of the KAK 13.9 or any other budget companies that I should check out in the comments down below. But with all that out of the way, guys, thank you so much for watching. I hope you all enjoyed. I'm going to go inside because it's freezing out here. Bye. I mean, peace out.